June 26, 1941. A dawn fog hung like a shroud over the potato fields outside Raseiniai, Lithuania. The air smelled of diesel and wet earth. The thin high light of summer struggled through the mist and turned rivets and tracks into brief glints. Lieutenant Karl Heine, staff officer to Oberstleutnant Friedrich Meyer of Panzer Regiment 8, rode in the cramped command half-track at the head of the column. He could taste metal and coffee and the oily dust that gathered in every crease of his uniform. Around him, the regiment's Panzer III and Panzer IV turrets creaked as crews rubbed their eyes and checked final oil levels. Radios crackled with static and German voices that tried to sound calm. They had been moving hard for 2 days, pushing deeper into the Soviet Union under Army Group North's orders. The morale was high. The maps had been easy to draw and the road signs had been changing into better-known names. Meyer, a square-jawed veteran with the pale eyes of someone used to maps more than people, barked terse commands into his portable telephone and peered through his binoculars. The wooded rise at the far side of the field looked empty. Grass brushed the hulls like indifferent. And then the first T-34 came into view. It appeared like any other tank at first, a dark silhouette breaking the line of the horizon, but then the men saw the hull shape and something in the quiet went wrong. The T-34's glacis plate met the light at an angle that made the tank look flatter, more compact, almost lean. Its turret was low and rounded, its tracks wide and caked in the gray mud of the east. Sergeant Wilhelm Krauss, commander of Panzer III Ausf F, snorted. "Russian scrap," he said, voice carrying just enough for the men around him to hear. "An odd duck. Looks like it would tip over in a ditch." Meyer gave a short, self-assured laugh. The regiment's intelligence files were thin. Reports from the front were still coming in. Most officers had already formed their categories. Soviet tanks were slow, boxy, undergunned. The Panzerkampfwagen and the 3 and 4 had trained crews, radios, and doctrine, and that mattered. The new unfamiliar silhouette did not. A captain from the forward reconnaissance troop, blond, young with a cigarette dangling from his lip, lifted his binoculars and announced, "It's got sloped armor. Looks tricked out, but I bet it's the same old 75 in there." They all grinned at each other in that way soldiers do when they are sure of an outcome. When Krauss's loader cracked the hatch of his Panzer III, the smell of hot oil and Bren gun grease filled the air, and the men clinked tin cups and noted, with the half-interest of men who have seen too many strange things, that Soviet crews were scrambling around a strange green hull. The T-34 was unmoving at first, as if deciding whether to be seen. Then its commander, a lieutenant by the look of his shoulder straps, dark hair matted to his forehead, ducked out of his cupola. He was not the caricature of a savage Russian soldier the German papers had promised. He was young, tenser, his mustache thin. He barked orders in a language the Germans only half understood. A young loader slammed a hatch shut. The T-34's main gun, a 76.2mm L11, swung slowly, measured. Krauss ordered a shot, the way a man orders a meal. The Panzer III's 50mm Ketebadouke barrel clicked into alignment. It was standard procedure: engage, disable, move on. The Panzer IV's short-barrel 75mm howitzer trained too, ready for closer work. The men had practiced against wooden mock-ups that did not wind back. They calculated angles, ranges, and victory. They had been taught that Soviet armor was liable to shatter or catch fire rather than resist. The first round struck the T-34 and glanced off. Sparks bloomed like tiny fireworks against that oddly angled glacis. The Germans watched their shells skid away, spalling harmlessly along the slope. A second hit, a third. Each impact seemed only to make the green hull grin. The men fell silent. Radio operators fumbled for words that did not exist in their handbook. "Cannot believe it," muttered Captain Bauer, a platoon leader who had led assaults in Poland and France. He tried to keep the edge out of his voice but failed. Somewhere in the column, a mechanic cursed and spat. The idea that a Soviet tank could shrug off German fire with such equanimity was a slap that landed on an entire doctrine. Meyer shoved his binoculars up, trying to read rivet patterns, seams, anything that explained the miracle. The T-34 rolled forward with a surprising grace. Its wide tracks chewed up the field and flung clods of mud. Its turret traversed smoothly, and when it fired back, the round met a German Panzer hull with a sound like a collapsing roof. One German tank lurched, smoke streaming from a ruptured fuel line. Men staggered as if a hand had shoved them. Laughter, that brittle laughter of men who had only just realized they were wrong, rows half-formed among the officers. Then the reality, metal, screaming, and hot, shut the laughter down. A corporal slumped beside his tank, face white. The T-34 in those first moments was not a legend. It was a problem. Sloped armor that increased effective thickness without extra weight. A Christie suspension and wide tracks that moved through mud where German tanks choked. A low, compact silhouette that made it a smaller target. But German reports would not contain the language yet. For the crews watching across that field, it was a presence, immediate and uncompromising. For Meyer and his men, the mockery dissolved into a different animal, fascination edged with fear. Meyer, silent now, felt a small, hot panic at his throat. Doctrine did not cover this. Equipment tables did not have an asterisk for a tank that refused to die under their standard engagement. He glanced down the line at his men. They were still trained, still competent, and they would learn fast. But in that first hour outside Raseiniai, the knowledge was new and jagged. The enemy had a tank that laughed at their assumptions. October the 2nd, 1941. The air outside Mtsensk was sharp and wet with the smell of rain-soaked earth and burnt rubber. Birch trees lined the muddy roads, their leaves yellow and trembling in the cold wind. The ground squelched beneath boots as Soviet tank crews scrambled to refuel and rearm. Somewhere deeper in the mist, engines coughed to life, harsh, growling throats of steel. Captain Mikhail Katukov, commander of the 4th Tank Brigade, stood beside his T-34, running a gloved hand over the damp armor. It was scarred, streaked with soot, a survivor of dozens of engagements since the summer retreat. His men were weary, red-eyed, hands trembling from too little sleep and too much fuel vapor. But they were alive. In his field notebook, Katukov had scrawled a single phrase that morning. "They think we're finished. Let's teach them to think again." Across the valley, Guderian's 4th Panzer Division was advancing. German armor, confident, deliberate, rolled eastward in neat formations. Their tracks pressed the black mud into neat furrows. The offensive toward Moscow had begun, and the Wehrmacht expected another smooth encirclement, another pocket of shattered Soviet divisions. They had not yet learned to fear the T-34. Katukov's brigade lay in wait along a series of low ridges near Mtsensk. The tanks were positioned behind hedgerows and camouflaged under branches, engines idling low. The men checked their optics again and again, adjusting the simple periscopes and sights. The orders were clear. Wait until they are in range. Hit hard. Disappear. When the first German panzers appeared, it was almost serene, gray shapes emerging through the mist, their hulls gleaming faintly. The Germans had grown accustomed to charging forward, to seeing Soviet machines burst into flames at the first exchange. But what met them here was different. Katukov's gunner, Sergeant Ivan Petrov, squinted down his sight and whispered, 200 meters. He could see the lead Panzer IV turning, its short 75mm gun scanning the tree line. Katukov's voice was low, calm. Fire! The 76.2mm round screamed out, cutting through the damp air. It hit the Panzer's side armor with a thunderclap, and the turret blew clean off. Flames rose like a torch into the morning sky. Before the shock settled, 3 more T-34s roared from concealment, engines snarling as they advanced down the slope. The Germans reacted with precision, return fire flashing, shells hammering into the ridge. But again their rounds skidded off the sloped armor, glancing away like raindrops. Crews inside the German tanks shouted into radios, disbelief mixing with discipline. A lieutenant in a Panzer III screamed, "They're impervious. Aim for the tracks!" But even the treads, wide and well-protected, shrugged off glancing hits. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Smoke clung to the ground, black and sticky. Katukov's tanks darted from cover to cover, using speed as armor. The T-34s could shift positions where German tanks bogged down. Their diesel engines growled low and steady while Panzer engines whined and coughed in the mud. By mid-morning, Guderian's division had stalled. Reports flooded in, tanks destroyed, infantry cut off, anti-tank guns overrun. In the division's command vehicle, an aide read out a situation report. Unknown new Soviet medium tank. Extremely fast. Armor impenetrable to standard weapons. Recommend immediate technical study. Guderian's face remained expressionless, but his tone hardened. Get me every detail. Every drawing. Every piece of one of those things you can find. Far from his command post, German recovery crews crawled over shattered T-34s, sketching hull angles and noting the absence of rivets. One officer remarked almost grudgingly, Ingenious.
Damned ingenious.
Sloped armor, all-welded construction, wide tracks. It's as if the terrain was built for it. But not all T-34s lay broken. By afternoon, Katukov's brigade had withdrawn intact, having destroyed over 40 German vehicles in a single day. His men ate cold bread in silence, watching the horizon light up with burning machines. The laughter that had once followed Soviet armor was gone now, replaced by something new. Curiosity tinged with respect. In Berlin, engineers began sketching countermeasures. Designers at MAN and Henschel pored over field reports and interrogation notes. One memo circulated in the Waffenamt in late October read, "Our new tank must match the T-34 in speed and exceed it in armor and firepower." The project was codenamed Panzer, but for the men on the ground, that was theory. The reality was simpler. The Red Army had found its steel backbone. As night fell over Mtsensk, Katukov stood beside his tank, cigarette glowing in the dark. He watched the distant flicker of German fires, their smoke trailing into the stars. His gunner murmured, "Do you think they'll be back tomorrow?" Katukov exhaled slowly. "Of course," he said. "But tomorrow they'll come knowing what waits for them." November 23, 1942. West of the Don River, the world was frozen in mud and smoke. The air reeked of cordite, diesel, and something more intimate, burnt flesh and scorched oil. Columns of steam rose from shattered machines, forming ghosts over the steppe. The 24th Panzer Division, once proud veterans of France and the Balkans, was collapsing into a pocket. Their tanks were low on fuel, their crews half-starved, their confidence bleeding away with every shell that fell. The Red Army had encircled the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. Amid the chaos, a formation of T-34s from the 26th Tank Corps advanced through the snow-blown night, engines rumbling like beasts under ice. The machines wore whitewash camouflage, streaked with soot from days of continuous fighting. Their breath, if machines could breathe, came in thick black plumes from their exhausts. Lieutenant Sergei Volkov rode in the lead T-34, his gloved hand steady on the turret ring. His crew had not slept for nearly 30 hours. Inside the cramped steel belly it was stifling. Gunpowder, sweat, and the claustrophobic rhythm of machinery. The intercom crackled as the driver, Corporal Cherepanov, muttered, "Fuel low, Comrade Lieutenant. 20 kilometers, maybe less." Volkov glanced through the vision slit. The terrain ahead was a graveyard of German armor. Panzer IIIs and IVs burnt down to their frames, their once gray paint now a charred, oily black. He could see the remains of a half-track, its rear door open as if the crew had tried to flee. Somewhere in the snow, a German helmet lay face up, filling with frost. The T-34s rolled on. Behind them, Soviet infantry trudged forward, rifles slung, bayonets catching the first gray light. This was not a charge now, not a desperate defense. It was a methodical hunt. The German defenders at Gumrak Airfield were running low on everything: ammunition, morale, even belief. Their supply lines were shattered, their once invincible airlift crippled by the weather and Soviet flak. Major Ernst Weller, commander of a Panzer company, watched his last operational Panzer IV idle in the cold. Its gun breech was cracked. The recoil system leaked oil. He rubbed frost from the rangefinder and muttered to himself, "If we can hold till relief." But he knew better. Moments later, his sentry shouted out to movement on the ridge. Weller raised his binoculars and froze. Silhouetted against the dawn were 5 T-34s, spaced perfectly, moving in fluid synchronization. No grand formations, no parades, just clean, disciplined motion. They paused, turrets turning as one. Heinrich, his gunner, whispered, "We'll never penetrate that." Weller said nothing. He knew the math now. At 200 meters, the Panzer's 75mm short gun couldn't reliably pierce the T-34's sloped armor. At 100 maybe, but that meant suicide range. The first Soviet shell screamed in and struck a German half-track, sending it cartwheeling into fire. Another hit the Panzer IV's right track, throwing it sideways into a crater. Weller's ears rang. He coughed black smoke. Through the periscope, he saw one T-34 close the distance, its gun roaring again and again, unhurried. When his tank was finally disabled, Weller climbed out into the biting wind and saw what he could not deny. The Red Army had evolved. The T-34 was no longer a curiosity. It was doctrine made flesh. In Moscow, the factories at Gorky and Nizhny Tagil were operating 24 hours a day. Assembly lines churned like rivers of molten determination. Soviet workers, many of them women and teenagers, hammered, welded, and riveted with numb hands. They called the T-34 Bratishka, little brother, and sent it off to war with chalked slogans on its armor. For the motherland. A for Ivan. A for revenge. The German intelligence summaries grew darker by the week. Reports spoke of mass employment of T-34s in combined arms formations, of improved models with heavier guns, the T-34-43 variant with a longer 76mm cannon. For every tank Germany destroyed, 5 more seemed to appear. And yet the T-34 crews were not invincible. Volkov's own brigade lost half its machines in a single day near Kalach-on-Don. Mines, air attacks, and mechanical failures took their toll. But the difference was in spirit. The men no longer retreated in confusion. They advanced even when the odds mocked them. By January 1943, the pocket at Stalingrad was sealed. German prisoners, tens of thousands of them, shuffled east through the snow. Among the captured officers, stories spread like fever. Those Russian tanks, and they came from nowhere. Like ghosts, like winter itself. Volkov's T-34 rolled past the ruins of a downed Ju-52. He reached out and brushed a hand across the frost-covered fuselage. They thought they'd bury us, he murmured to his gunner. Instead, they taught us how to fight. From Raseiniai to Stalingrad, the laughter that had once followed the Red Army's tanks was gone. In its place was a grim understanding on both sides. The balance of power was shifting, and the sound of that shift was the low, constant growl of a T-34 engine in the cold. July 5, 1943, 4:00 a.m. The steppe near the village of Prokhorovka trembled as if the earth itself was holding its breath. A low metallic hum rolled across the fields, not thunder but the gathering heartbeat of 2 armored armies about to collide. The air was heavy with the smell of grass and gasoline, dew glinting on the hulls of hundreds of tanks lined up in the gray half-light. On the Soviet side, Captain Yuri Sokolov stood in his T-34-76, hands resting on the hatch rim. His eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but his face was calm. Around him, rows upon rows of tanks stretched to the horizon. Green shapes crouched in the mist like predators ready to pounce. To the west, the faint outlines of German armor moved into position. Panthers, Tigers, and Ferdinand tank destroyers, the pride of the Wehrmacht's new Panzer divisions. Operation Citadel was underway. The largest tank battle in human history was about to begin. The Soviet command had known it was coming. Intelligence from partisans, reconnaissance flights, and even British code intercepts had confirmed the German buildup. The Red Army dug in, layer after layer, minefields, anti-tank ditches, camouflaged gun positions, and waiting behind them the T-34s, thousands of them. When the first artillery barrage ripped open the dawn, the sound was like mountains breaking apart. The sky flickered white and red as shells rained down. Then came the order, peered. Forward! Sokolov slammed the hatch shut and shouted to his driver. Advance! The T-34 lurched forward, treads grinding over soft earth. The radio crackled with overlapping voices. Tankers calling out bearings, hits, orders drowned by static and gunfire. Through his periscope, Sokolov saw flashes, German muzzle fire from across the valley. A Tiger tank, massive, gray, and terrifying, emerged from a line of trees ahead. Its long 88mm gun turned slowly, almost lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. Target 200 meters! Yelled Sokolov's gunner, Corporal Misha Danilov. The T-34's cannon roared, and the shell struck the Tiger's turret. Sparks flew, but it did not penetrate. The Tiger replied, and the return shot punched through a T-34 beside them, turning it into a rolling torch. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Smoke, fire, and the thunder of engines merged into a single monstrous roar. Tanks collided at point-blank range, trading shots so close that muzzle flashes blinded the crews. The air was thick with dust and screams over the intercoms. Despite their technical disadvantage, the T-34s moved with feral agility. Where the Tigers and Panthers hesitated on uneven ground, the T-34s surged forward. Their wide tracks and powerful diesel engines allowed them to crest ridges, flank, and close the distance, the one place where their 76mm guns could still kill. Sokolov's tank smashed through the wreck of a Panzer IV, its hull plates glowing orange from heat. He saw a Tiger dead ahead, its turret jammed from a previous hit. He shouted, "Ram it!" The driver didn't hesitate. The T-34 slammed into the Tiger's side, steel screeching against steel. The Soviet crew leapt out and tossed grenades into the hatch, vanishing behind a curtain of flame. All around them, the fields of Kursk burned. Tanks lay gutted and blackened, their ammunition cooking off in dull thuds. Horses ran wild between the wrecks. Above, Soviet IL-2 Sturmovik aircraft dove low, strafing German positions with rockets and cannon fire. By nightfall, the fields were a sea of glowing wreckage, twisted hulls, shattered treads, the charred remains of men and machines. The Germans had advanced, but not enough. Their offensive stalled under relentless counterattacks. The much-vaunted Panthers rushed into battle before their design flaws were fixed, broke down in droves. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 2 more took its place. In a field command post behind the lines, General Rotmistrov received word of the carnage. His voice was hoarse when he reported to Stavka, "We've stopped them. The steel wave has broken." Across the battlefield, German officers stared in disbelief. What they had faced was not the disorganized, panicked Red Army of 1941. It was a machine, coordinated, disciplined, and burning with vengeance. At dusk, Sokolov climbed from his T-34, its armor blackened, its left track half destroyed. He looked over the field. Thousands of tanks, friend and foe, reduced to smoking husks. The horizon glowed red under the evening clouds. He removed his helmet and whispered, "So this is what victory looks like." In Berlin, the shock was immediate. Hitler raged at his generals, demanding explanations. How had the Soviets not only stopped the offensive but counterattacked? How could the T-34, a machine they once mocked as crude, stand against Germany's best armor? But the truth was simple. The T-34 wasn't just a tank anymore. It was an idea, rugged, adaptable, and mass-producible, a symbol of a nation that refused to break. Kursk marked the end of German initiative on the Eastern Front. From that moment forward, the Wehrmacht would fight defensively, retreating step by step, always with the sound of T-34s echoing behind them. January 17, 1945, the Vistula River, Poland. The temperature hovered at 12 below zero and the world was locked in frost. The landscape, barns, trees, even corpses, was encased in a brittle glass of ice. Under a pale sky, the Red Army's engine stirred once more. The push toward Berlin had begun. Captain Yuri Sokolov, older now, gaunt from years of combat and winters that seemed to last forever, stood atop a new T-34-85, its long-barreled 85mm gun glinting in the weak sun. Around him, hundreds of tanks idled in formation. Exhaust fumes drifted like fog, muffling the world in diesel breath. This was no longer the desperate army of 1941 or even the hardened survivor of Kursk. This was a juggernaut, mechanized, confident, and relentless. Behind every tank came columns of infantry on American-supplied Studebaker trucks, Katyusha rocket batteries, and waves of artillery that stretched for kilometers. The Red Army had learned the language of industrial warfare, and the T-34 was still its native tongue. As the order came, "Advance." The entire line lurched forward. The ice cracked under the weight. The earth trembled. Across the frozen Vistula, the T-34s surged west, their treads grinding over snow, bridges, and wreckage. German rearguards, scattered formations of the once mighty Panzer divisions, tried to hold. But their numbers were thin, their supply lines shredded by Allied bombers. The Luftwaffe was a ghost, its few remaining fighters grounded by fuel shortages. In a ruined Polish village, smoke rose from shattered chimneys. Sokolov's company advanced cautiously through the debris. The streets were lined with wrecked wagons and abandoned carts. A dog barked once and disappeared. Suddenly a shot rang out, a German Panther hidden in the shadows of a barn. Its shell tore through a T-34 at the head of the column, blowing the turret clean off in a burst of fire. The crew didn't even have time to scream. Sokolov barked orders.
"Flank left."
"Smoke out the bastard." His gunner traversed the turret and loosed a shell. It missed, smashing into a wall of frozen hay. The Panther fired again, the roar echoing between the ruins. Another T-34 burst into flame. But the Soviet tanks kept moving, One circled behind the barn, its diesel engine roaring. The Panther's gun swung too slow. The T-34 fired point blank, its 85mm shell punching clean through the German side armor. The explosion tore the barn apart, sending a snowstorm of wood and fire into the air. Sokolov exhaled, heart hammering. "They still hit hard," he muttered. His loader just nodded. The advance continued. Across Poland, Silesia, and into East Prussia, the T-34s became an unstoppable tide. In cities like Łódź and Poznań, they smashed through barricades and anti-tank guns. They crossed rivers under fire, dragging rafts of ammunition and wounded behind them. The T-34-85's new gun could finally duel with German heavy tanks. Not always win, but fight. And when one fell, two more rolled forward to replace it. For the Germans, the sound of the T-34 was a nightmare that returned every morning, a rumbling, rhythmic thunder that meant encirclement was near. In the frozen fields near Königsberg, a group of German officers watched through binoculars as waves of Soviet tanks advanced. One, Major Heinrich Stahl, turned to his adjutant. "We used to laugh at those machines," he said quietly. "Now they're everywhere. They don't stop." The adjutant said nothing. He was watching the horizon where the black smoke of burning tanks met the gray sky. By April, the Red Army was at the gates of Berlin. The streets of the capital, once immaculate avenues of marble and glass, were rubble-strewn canyons. The Reichstag loomed over the ruined city like a carcass picked clean by war. Sokolov's battalion reached the outskirts on April 25th. They were met not by organized divisions, but by pockets of resistance, SS units, Hitler Youth, and the desperate remnants of the Wehrmacht. The T-34s rolled down Charlottenburg's boulevards, their armor streaked with soot, their turrets pocked with shrapnel scars. The smell of smoke and brick dust hung heavy in the air. Each block was a battle. Panzerfausts fired from windows. Molotov cocktails rained from rooftops. Soviet infantry followed close behind the tanks, using their hulls as moving cover. The city was an inferno of muzzle flashes and collapsing walls. In one square, Sokolov's tank took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust. The blast scorched the side armor, blackening the star painted on its hull. He coughed through the smoke, slamming the hatch open to get air. "We're fine. Keep going," he shouted, though his ears rang and his throat burned. By nightfall, the Red Army had breached the city's heart. Berlin burned in every direction, an ocean of flame reflecting off the low clouds. The T-34s moved like ghosts through the firelight, their silhouettes cutting across the ruins of the Reich's capital. In the distance, the thunder of artillery rolled endlessly. And still, through smoke and chaos, the same sound persisted, that familiar, relentless growl of T-34 engines pushing forward. The machine that the Germans once dismissed as crude and backward was now leading the charge into their own capital. April 30th, 1945, Berlin. The sky above the city was the color of smoke and gunmetal. The air was thick with the stink of cordite, dust, and the burning of things once meant to last forever. Books, furniture, dreams. In the heart of the dying Reich, the thunder of Soviet artillery never stopped. It rolled over the city like a tide that refused to recede. Captain Yuri Sokolov's T-34-85 crept down Wilhelmstrasse, its engine rumbling low, turret swiveling between gutted facades. Each intersection was a potential death trap. German soldiers, boys, old men, fanatics, fired Panzerfausts from basements and attics. The hull was pocked with scorch marks. The metal beneath Sokolov's gloves was hot, almost alive. Inside the tank, the air was stifling. Smoke, sweat, cordite. His gunner, Misha, murmured a prayer between breaths. The loader, young Pavel, wiped grime from his face with the back of his sleeve. "Captain," he whispered, "we're almost at the Reichstag." Sokolov nodded. Almost. Outside, Berlin was collapsing into itself. Soviet infantry moved through the rubble behind the tanks, shouting, firing, dragging wounded comrades through doorways. The once grand buildings of the Reich's capital were nothing but hollow shells, every street corner a fortress. But still, the T-34s pushed forward, through barricades of furniture, over wrecked trams, through walls if they had to. At the corner of Leipziger Strasse, a column of Panthers appeared, their turrets emerging from the smoke like the ghosts of a dead army. The last surviving German heavy tanks in the city. The first shot cracked like thunder. A Panther shell smashed into a building beside Sokolov's tank, showering the street with brick and glass. Target, 11 o'clock. Misha yelled, "Fire!" The 85mm cannon roared. The shell slammed into the Panther's mantlet, ricocheting in a blinding shower of sparks. The German tank turned its gun, slow, deliberate. Another round from Sokolov's T-34 fired, this time striking the turret ring. A burst of flame erupted from the Panther's hatches. The Soviet crews cheered, but only for a second. Another Panther appeared from behind the smoke and fired, its shell ripping through a T-34 ahead. The tank exploded in a ball of fire, turret thrown into the air like a coin. Sokolov didn't hesitate. "Advance! Get close!" The T-34 surged forward, closing the distance until the two tanks were less than 50 meters apart. At that range, the Panther's long 75mm couldn't traverse fast enough. Misha fired again. The shell hit the German side armor penetration. The Panther erupted, black smoke pouring from its seams. Sokolov's tank rolled past the wreck, its treads grinding over shattered cobblestones and twisted steel. Hours later, under the choking haze of gunfire and dust, the Red Army reached the Reichstag. T-34s lined the square, engines idling like growling beasts waiting to be unleashed again. The great building, once the seat of German power, stood blackened and broken, its pillars cratered by shells. Infantry swarmed forward under covering fire. Sokolov dismounted, his boots sinking into the ash. He watched as soldiers of the 150th Rifle Division carried a red banner through the smoke and up the battered steps. Machine gun fire rattled from inside, echoing through the marble halls. And then, as evening bled into night, the flag rose, crimson against the gray sky. Berlin had fallen. Sokolov leaned against the side of his tank, the steel warm beneath his palms. He listened to the distant rumble of artillery still firing somewhere west of the city, to the crackle of burning wood, to the whisper of wind through the ruins. His men sat nearby, silent, exhausted. Misha lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Pavel stared up at the Reichstag's dome, his eyes hollow. After a long moment, Sokolov said quietly, "Do you remember Raseiniai?" Misha laughed weakly. "When the Germans laughed at us?" "I remember," Sokolov nodded. "They stopped laughing a long time ago." He turned to look at the tank, the same silhouette that had crawled out of the mud 4 years ago, that had burned its way from the Don to Berlin. The armor was scarred, pitted, and streaked with soot, but the red star still shone faintly beneath the grime. To the Germans, it had become a symbol of terror. The sound of its engine meant the front was collapsing, that no wall could stand long. To the Soviets, it was something else entirely, a monument of endurance, the tank that had outlasted defeat, winter, and the war itself. As the first light of May 1st touched the skyline, Sokolov climbed back into the turret one last time. He looked out through the slit of the periscope at the city below, at the smoke curling from rooftops, at the distant shimmer of the Spree River. He whispered, not to anyone in particular, "This is where it ends." The engine rumbled, steady as a heartbeat. The T-34, the machine that had once been mocked as primitive, had rolled from the fields of Raseiniai to the heart of the Reich, and in doing so, it had rewritten the history of modern war. It was more than a tank now. It was the sound of inevitability,